And once again, let me officially welcome everybody to today's webinar, the Conservation Finance Forum, Aggregation and Mitigation for Forest Conservation. Today's event is hosted by the Conservation Finance Forum at the Harvard Forest and assisted by the Ash Center's Government Innovators Network. And I'd like to turn things over to today's moderator, Jim Levitt, who is the director of the program on conservation innovation at the Harvard Forest. Mr. Levitt.
Good morning, everyone. I'm talking to you again from Cambridge, Massachusetts. The skies are blue outside, and the leaves are just beginning to turn a beautiful yellow and red outside our window. I am happy to be back here after a beautiful summer and to welcome you all to the first session of the 2010-2011 academic year. We have two extremely well-qualified guests to speak with us today about the topics of aggregation and mitigation for forest conservation. I want to introduce them by saying that I've had the opportunity to spend the last year studying aggregation and mitigation as part of an initiative that was sponsored by the Massachusetts Environmental Trust, and the report from that study has just been released in the last 24 hours. It's called Financing Forest Conservation Across the Commonwealth and is available at www.wildlandsandwoodlands.org. You can also get the report by emailing me directly at james_levitt@harvard.edu. The focus of the report is the focus of the two speakers that we have today. That is the technique of aggregation as a method of financing forest conservation, as well as the technique of mitigation for forest conservation and for the conservation of other kind of landscapes, seascapes, and natural resources in the United States and across North America. So with that, I want to introduce to you Leigh Youngblood, and we will get that bio right in front of you now. Leigh is the Executive Director of the Mount Grace Land Conservation Trust. She has been there for, I believe, about 2 decades and really has pioneered the practice of aggregating small parcels of land into larger projects that begin to form corridors for land and water conservation in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and beyond. Leigh, are you there?
Yes, I am here. Can you hear me?
I hear you very well. So Leigh has a brief presentation for us on the practice of aggregation. Leigh, before you start with your presentation, can you just give me a brief summary of how you got interested in the field of land conservation and how aggregation came to your attention?
Well, I got interested in land conservation beginning in my work with doing wetland regulation for the town of Ware, where I ran into a lot of landowners developing their land because they needed to sell it, they couldn't afford property taxes, and they were unaware of conservation options. So being a lover of nature, I was inspired and motivated to go back to school and learn about conservation so that I could have a career doing land conservation at a land trust. I was very fortunate to land at Mount Grace. And so the thing that I really like the most is helping landowners protect their land, and it fits very well in the context that we work within. At Mount Grace, you'll see a map shortly that the landscape that Mount Grace operates in has just tremendous opportunities for landscape scale conservation. So that's how those two things came together.
Leigh, would you take us to your first slide, and we'll spend about 10 or 15 minutes with you considering the idea of aggregation.
Okay. So I'm jumping to my second slide. I just want to give you an overview of what I'm going to talk about. This is all based on my experience over 10 years with landscape scale conservation. And so I'm going to talk about the common elements to these projects, the unique elements to each of the 10 projects, the important partnership elements, and some comments about the effectiveness of aggregation as an approach to landscape scale conservation. So keeping in mind that Mount Grace Land Conservation Trust is a regional land trust in Massachusetts where parcel sizes are very small, and there are many land trusts. We have 6 statewide or national land trusts, about 10 regional land trusts like Mount Grace, and more than 100 local land trusts. And you can see on this map that there is a lot of protected land in our region. We cover 23 towns, and about 40% of the land is already protected by many state and federal agencies and municipalities and land trusts. So Mount Grace has the opportunity to partner with many different organizations. And aggregation is simply one of the strategies that we use to fund conservation projects. So this is a list of the various aggregation projects that Mount Grace has participated in over the years. And while you can peruse that, I'm going to talk about the common elements. So with each of these projects, and hopefully your projects, there's a defined project area that has significant landscape scale natural features, but also has cultural features. For example, trails or distinctive and much loved landscape features. This is important to get local support, community support, but also political support. The second element that I think is essential is a published rationale describing the imperative or the region that you've selected. In Mount Grace's example or experience, there was a landmark 1997 conservation biology report entitled The History and Importance of Land Use in the North Quabbin Region. This is published by Harvard Forest, and it happens to be the region that Mount Grace works within. And this was easy publication to point to support our work and the need for the work and all of these projects. So others are, the Wildlands and Woodlands vision, state biomap, wildlife action plans, and also, more recently, the call for climate change mitigation and adaptation. There's a lot being published about that. Another essential element is streamlining of systems for processing projects. When you start doing landscape scale projects, it's not going to be business as usual anymore, and it requires an organizational willingness to change systems or create systems if they're not already there. Also, a culture of partnering is important, and that was really what got Mount Grace started. And if that doesn't exist in your region, frankly, I don't think you're going to get very far with landscape scale conservation because one organization can't control landscape scale conservation. You have to partner, and you should partner well. And another essential element is that we had from the very beginning with our first project, the Tully Initiative, is top-down and bottom-up support. So we were very fortunate. You can see Mount Grace got started with the biggest project. We're now involved in the Wildlands and Woodlands project, which is comparable size, but a more widespread geography. But the Tully Initiative took place over a 2-year period, was initiated by our Secretary of the Environment. And because there was Mount Grace was here, a local, well-accepted land trust, the local people were very supportive of this private forest land initiative. And so we had top-down and bottom-up support. So those are the main things. Those are the main 5 things. And I would say that what else I've seen, and you can see in this list, is having a phased implementation is helpful, and that demonstrates persistence in the area and the high priority of the resource. So all of these things together, I think, equal a great formula for access to increased funding, but I believe you need them all. And if you haven't done landscape scale conservation before, and there's a question that will be posed and you'll have a chance to answer, but if you haven't done landscape scale conservation before and you want to do it, I encourage you to just do it because your organizational capacity will be developed through doing your first project, and that'll lead you on to others. As you can see, it's led Mount Grace to others. So now I'm going to move on to the unique elements just briefly about each of the projects. Every aggregation project is unique. That's what's nice. It adapts to all scales and all resource types. And so the things that are in common are partnering and working with multiple landowners across a landscape. So our first project was a subbasin, the Tully River watershed. This was a phenomenal project that took place over 2 years, and I personally negotiated 90 deals over 2 years. And it was initiated by the Commonwealth. They approached Mount Grace, and in a 2-year period, we protected 20% of the non-conserved land in this project area. And that was primarily through conservation easements. And it was a multi-agency project that included 2 state agencies and ultimately 2 land trusts. And so you can see the results there. It built on that previous corridor that I showed you, which, if I can do this, this is the area of the Tully Initiative, and you can see the number of facilitated projects largely reflect the Tully Initiative. So now I'm going to move on. Then, well, the next thing that we did is what grew from the Tully Initiative is the awareness of our neighbors in New Hampshire. The state line runs across this map right about here. This is New Hampshire, this is Massachusetts, and the Society for the Preservation of New Hampshire Forests was interested in landscape scale forest conservation, read about the results of the Tully Initiative, which took place right on the state line, and so together we now have a 2-state collaboration that's primarily planning and not project implementation, but it has led to Mount Grace pursuing projects on the New Hampshire border. And we have, part of the reason for this is to access larger sources of funding, and in fact that's working. We have gotten New Hampshire and Massachusetts federal appropriations. But back to actual projects. This is the first federal project. This is the Quabbin Corridor connection. So this is the east side of that North Quabbin Corridor. And because we had a very active and functioning partnership, regional partnership of multi-level, state agencies, nonprofits, federal partners, academic partners, municipal partners, we're able to do the Tully Initiative, which was state-funded, but it also gave us the experience to go forward and do this federally funded multi-landowner project. And the reason we did this is because we had 2 unfunded forest legacy projects. And so the idea came from Bob O'Connor, who works at the Office of Environmental Affairs, and said, why not combine these and make a larger project? So we put together 20 landowners and approximately 2,000 acres. And this was the first large-scale multi-landowner forest legacy project in the country, really. There had been others with 4 or 5 neighboring parcels, but this was a large scale, and we've persisted with these. I'm going to move to the next slide. So then this map is more complicated. This demonstrates that we have, you might have noticed, the phased, this is Southern Monadnock Plateau 1, 2, and 3. And you can see the landscape scale, you can see the town boundaries. These parcels are not adjacent to each other, but they are in the same ecoregion that is being protected, and also there is a trail here, and this a couple of trails you can see on the map. And priority projects come from various partners. This is a project initiated at first by a state agency that, of course, worked with us previously, and then has been pursued by the North Quabbin Regional Landscape Partnership, which is a partnership that's existed for 12 years now and continues to serve multiple land trusts of all sizes in our region. And that really has led to the ability to have excellent landowner contacts and have a constant stream of willing landowners that want to participate in these funding opportunities. Another example of a multi-phase forest legacy project is the Metacomet Monadnock Forest. We're now in phase 3. We've just applied for federal fiscal year 12 funding, 15 landowners, 1,400 acres, and this is the 3rd phase in the same region. There has been, it's not all smooth sailing, and there's different reasons for the funding. But putting together, for example, with MMF, as we call it, the project area is significant because there's the confluence of 3 federal investments. There's forest legacy investments, There's also New England National Scenic Trail and the Conti Wildlife Refuge all exist in this region, and it increases Forest Legacy's interest in this area. So then the example that is different, so we have mostly, we have the state-funded Tully Initiative, multiple Forest Legacy, Wildlands and Woodlands Conservation Project. This aims to be primarily privately funded. It's the first effort to complement the significant increase in public funding with private dollars. And this is a project that's underway. 7 land trusts came together, brought together 70 landowners, 10,000 acres. So here we have a multi-landowner, multi-land trust collaboration. And we have cooperative focus areas and are doing cooperative fundraising. So I'll just briefly show you an example. This is the North Quabbin Forest focus area. What's important here is that all of these projects are not Mount Grace projects. So we pick a focus area, and where we have multiple partners active in those areas, the projects are brought together cooperatively. And this is another focus area in Wildlands and Woodlands project, the Vermont Piedmont Headwaters, same thing, multiple land trusts, one focus area, and we're fundraising cooperatively. So now I want to wrap up just by saying some of the partnership elements that I mentioned are necessary to succeed in these. So I would say that the best results really come from not only multiple land trusts, but multi-level land trust participation. You get a certain hybrid vigor from having state organizations, regional organizations, and local organizations all bringing different resources, make for a stronger partnership and stronger projects. Jim writes a lot about the potential for efficiencies, cost efficiencies, time efficiencies. These have to be built in. They're not automatic. We all know that the perception that collaboration can take more time than it's worth, but I really believe that if you intentionally build in efficiencies, the sum is equal to more than the parts. The idea of cooperative fundraising is novel, and we have some practice at it. So we have cooperatively spent capital, getting large grants and distributing it to smaller land trusts, and now we're combining to cooperatively raise capital. We're doing this. Mount Grace is in a similar effort with Wildlands and Woodlands Conservation Project, but also an AmeriCorps project, Mass Lift, which we have 7 different land trusts that are cooperatively fundraising for a single project in multiple land trust regions. So as far as effectiveness, and Jim Cooney, I wonder if you can at some point post the questions. I want to, it's a little bit interactive and find out some of the history of the participants.
Leigh, this is Jim.
Yes.
I think let's hold off on that just because we started a little late, and I want to give Bob Bendick the 15 minutes. We may come into that interactive part of it in the last part of the session, but right now I think it's better for time if we move ahead. So you want to say a couple of concluding remarks, and then we'll flip over to Bob?
Yeah, I'll just wrap up by saying that my pitch that aggregation, I think, is extremely effective for landscape scale conservation, and clearly it's a change of business from doing one parcel at a time. And, it's all the more imperative with the awareness of climate change, adaptation, and mitigation strategies. We're not going to achieve those strategies one parcel at a time. And so being able to do landscape scale conservation more easily, having more funding is inevitable. And so I'm happy to have the opportunity to present it. And it's also true that it works at all scales and in all region types. And so I think it's a very adaptable strategy. And with that, I'll finish and stay tuned.
That was excellent. Thank you very much. I want to reemphasize that Leigh is someone who is all about results. And she has, with a relatively small land trust in north central Massachusetts, achieved remarkable results with aggregation, particularly over the last decade. So, Leigh, thank you very much for that introduction to aggregation. I want to also emphasize that The whole point of putting Leigh and Bob on this internet broadcast is because their techniques that they're talking about today, I believe, are widely applicable across North America and even beyond. And I think that's reflected by the people who registered for today's session. We have people from 30 states, from Wyoming to West Virginia, from Oregon, Wisconsin, Georgia, all over the country, who are interested in learning about something that has been brought to my attention because I spent some time in Massachusetts. We also have participants from 8 different countries, including Scotland, Argentina, Australia, India, Malaysia, Mexico, Peru, and Trinidad. So the ideas that you have in particular places, small places really, in North America may in fact have wide applicability across the globe, as may their ideas in North America. With that, I want to introduce Bob Bendick. Bob is the head of government relations for the Nature Conservancy, I should say U.S. government relations for the Nature Conservancy, which is itself the largest conservation organization in the world. Bob has a wealth of experience in environmental management and in conservation going back to the 1980s. He has worked in New England. He has worked in Florida. He is now based in Arlington, Virginia with TNC, and is a co-author of a landmark report on mitigation that was published by the Environmental Law Institute. I want to emphasize before we turn to Bob that the idea here is that mitigation and aggregation are complementary strategies. They ought, in the best of worlds, to build on one another, both to aggregate the supply of conservation land and, in some cases, to provide the funding and the human resources to both protect those natural resources and to steward them over time. So with that, Bob, good afternoon or good morning.
Good morning, Jim. Thank you.
Bob, do you want to jump right into your slide pack and begin?
I do, if you could put it up there. Okay, as Jim said, this was, what I'm going to talk about is based on a paper by the Nature Conservancy and the Environmental Law Institute. That paper is available online in several ways. Okay, let's see what happens here. So the hypothesis of what I'm going to talk about is that in the U.S. and in fact around the world, there's going to be a vast amount of infrastructure investment in energy and agriculture and water projects and all sorts of things over the next 15 or 20 years. And that will have impacts on the environment, and that the mitigation protocol, that is the idea of, in a systematic way, avoiding, minimizing, and if you can avoid and minimize, compensating for the environmental damage done by that infrastructure development, is a very promising approach, if done right, to conserving the environment on a fairly large scale. Just to make clear here, the avoid, minimize, and compensate protocol is often a function of various environmental laws, and I'll talk about that. But we're saying that it should be, in our hypothesis, used in a ecosystem scale framework, and that you can use a number of plans to make more intelligent decisions about what you avoid, how you minimize, and where and how you compensate. This is particularly important in a time of decreasing budgets for other things. So this little chart just shows, before the financial crash in the U.S., how much money was being spent on mitigation annually. So almost $4 billion. So in contrast to, say, the U.S. Land and Water Conservation Fund, this is an order of magnitude larger amount of money than has been appropriated during the same period. A good portion of that money, it is our view, let me go on to the next slide. Oops, sorry, went backwards. A good portion of that money has not been spent well, and I would guess maybe 40%. The avoidance and minimization decisions have been made on too narrow a context. A lot of mitigation took place on site with little ecological value, didn't last, very expensive, and even places where mitigation has been accumulated in mitigation banks, those banks maybe have not been located properly to work properly. Well, I'm having a bit of problem.
Can we move to the next slide for you? Would that be helpful?
That would be helpful.
Okay.
Just say next slide, and I'll move along.
So mitigation is built on a foundation of statutes. So in the U.S., the main statutes we're working with now are the Clean Water Act, Section 404, which deals with the regulation and loss of wetlands, the Endangered Species Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, energy development on public lands, the relicensing of hydroelectric dams, and Transportation Act projects. Those are the things we do now that where we base mitigation. Next slide. So our overall recommendations are, first, really pay attention to the avoid and minimize before you get to compensation. A great deal of environmental damage can be avoided, and land can be protected for regional purposes if you don't put the things that you're building in the wrong place. Secondly, do this thinking about the large ecosystem impacts of what you're avoiding and what you're saving. And then finally, when you get mitigation money for a project, invest that in the context of the larger ecosystem. So it lasts, so it is of a scale that can make a difference over time, so that it has some larger ecosystem function. Next slide. There are some new opportunities for doing this in addition to the existing opportunities. More species are being listed under the Endangered Species Act. Sage grouse, for example, in the West is a candidate species that covers a lot of territory. There is legislation pending on onshore and offshore energy development. The need to, the requirement to adhere to the mitigation protocol could be incorporated in that legislation in the next transportation bill. The whole issue of sea level rise and management of coastlines lends itself to this idea. The Department of Defense is very interested in mitigating its activities, and the Corps of Engineers in its own projects, not just in its regulatory function, could take greater advantage of mitigation. Next slide. So what are some examples of this? Massachusetts Enhanced Mitigation Program, a new one, is something I'll talk about in a minute. It is what we might call in lieu fee mitigation, and I'll explain that. The Northern Everglades project and the Disney Wilderness Preserve, very successful effort in Central Florida. We, with Environmental Law Institute, are now working on 2 pilot projects, one in Wisconsin and one in Tennessee, to take small, medium-sized watersheds, do a comprehensive plan for the protection of wetlands, and to use that as the future framework for mitigation. The Nature Conservancy is working on an approach we call development by design for siting and avoiding impacts and mitigating impacts in the oil fields of Wyoming. And there are all sorts of talk about mitigation and offsets in the siting of solar plants in the Mojave Desert just to the east of Los Angeles. Next. Next slide. So the Massachusetts Enhanced Mitigation Program is a partnership between the Nature Conservancy and the state of Massachusetts. It's mitigation for the loss of critical wildlife habitat. And the way this works is you can mitigate on site, you can do traditional things, but if you want to go quickly, you simply pay money into a fund after having tried to avoid whatever impacts you can avoid. Pay money into a fund that represents the impacts you are having. The Nature Conservancy then pools or accumulates that money from a number of small impacts and uses it to purchase large blocks of habitat that are significant in a ecosystem scale. And in this case, they focused on habitat for box turtles, but to create large enough blocks that can last on into the future. Next slide. In the Northern Everglades, very important large ecosystem that relates to the entire Everglades. About 15 years ago, the Nature Conservancy worked out an arrangement and with the Disney Corporation and all the regulators to, after avoiding and minimizing wetlands impacts on the creation of the animal kingdom of all places, their new theme park, that Disney would purchase a large cattle ranch at a strategic location in the watershed, give it to the Nature Conservancy, and pay to restore it. That work is done now. It's about 13,000 acres, highly successful in terms of restoring the original natural functions on that site. And now a cornerstone for protection of the larger Northern Everglades environment, all in accordance with a single plan. Next. Why is this useful? First, we have a deadlock of legislation in Washington. The better use, the more strategic use of mitigation can go forward without any additional appropriations or without any new legislation. There are all sorts of models already in place that can be followed and built on, all sorts of opportunities out there like energy siting that can be used more effectively. And the number of plans, eco-regional plans, other kinds of plans that can provide the ecosystem or watershed framework for the intelligent use of mitigation is increasing. State wildlife plans, state forestry plans, endangered species recovery plans. The raw material is there to do this well. Next. So what are the next steps? And this is, I believe, my last slide. The America's Great Outdoors process is underway, rethinking conservation in the 21st century. Mitigation should be part of that thinking. The Council on Environmental Quality and the Office of Management and Budget should really convene other agencies to take a uniform approach across the U.S. government. The Section 404 Clean Water Act regulations dealing with wetlands, following the pilot projects that we're doing, can be used much more broadly. That is the 2008 revisions to those regulations to encourage mitigation. And we have other pieces of legislation that may be coming up in which mitigation can be made a significant part if it's done right. Next. Next slide. That's it. This is how you can contact us. Time for questions. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Bob. That's very comprehensive and obviously of national significance. I'm going to ask the first question. I invite our listeners to click on the Q&A tab at the top of their computer screens and email in questions into the queue. We've already got 3 or 4 in the queue now, and I will select a number of them to ask to Leigh and to Bob. I also want to let you know that to the extent that you can hang on, we can go past our 12 o'clock time slot because we got a little bit of a late start here and extend the conversation to maybe 10 after or a quarter after 12.
Hi, and this is Jim Cooney. As just a technical pointer, I'm going to begin administering a few polling questions. They'll appear periodically on the screen. And when you see them, all you have to do is click on the option that is most appropriate for you, and you'll see the results as they tabulate. So just point and click.
All right, so Bob and Leigh, here's your first question. Part of the logic of this session was to pair together the executive director of a relatively small organization based in a house in Athol, Massachusetts, and a very large organization with headquarters in the Washington, D.C. area and with offices all over the world. My question to you for both mitigation and aggregation is, to what extent are partnerships significant both across geographies, that is across state lines, for example, across the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, and among both large and small organizations?
Leigh, why don't you go ahead?
Well, to me, this is a great example of how these issues are relevant at all scales. And Mount Brace, as a regional organization covering just 23 towns, can do a lot of conservation, but we need to do that in partnership with larger organizations like the Nature Conservancy that are able to affect federal policy. And then we are very prepared to put those dollars and opportunities into action. So that's my primary response.
Bob?
We think they're essential, and in our submission for the America's Great Outdoors outreach process, we've suggested that partnership landscapes in which many kinds of groups work together at a watershed or ecosystem or landscape scale is the key to conservation for America's future. And mitigation is one tool that can be used in that framework. But that's the way to go. That's the future of conservation in this country.
All right, great. As you can see on your screen, we've got a polling question running about what is the largest scale at which you've protected a land, at which you have protected land in a multi-landowner, multi-partner aggregation project. It looks like sub-watershed is out there in front, but there are a number of projects characterized as abutting parcels. So we're not, we don't have a lot of mountain range-sized projects, only one, I think, in this audience. A number of multi-state projects, which is interesting too, but I think that the experience in this landscape scale conservation realm is certainly young and growing, and so this is a result that we might well expect. Okay, I have the first question for Leigh and Bob from the listeners comes from Mike Speltz, who asks, how do Forest Legacy officials react to aggregated projects? Do they fear their funds will get tied up in the complexity? Do you have airtight purchase agreements with each landowner before submitting the bundled project? How much due diligence is done up front and at what cost? So there are about 5 questions there, and you can choose to answer 1 or 2. Leigh, we might want to start with you. And does Forest Legacy fear that their funds will get tied up in aggregated projects?
Well, we've been very pleased with the response of Forest Legacy to this idea, and I'm looking at a copy of a 2009 speech from the Chief of the Forest Service, Tom Sidwell, where he's talking about the importance of landscape scale conservation. And so it certainly is an idea. Landscape scale conservation itself and aggregation is recognized as the way to make these projects happen. So, you know, over the course of now 6 fiscal years, Mount Grace and the North Quabbin Regional Landscape Partnership have had multi-landowner projects funded by the Forest Service and Forest Legacy Program. So I think they're getting used to it, and we're getting used to it, and systems are improving. And as far as due diligence and agreements with landowners, there is a huge time horizon with Forest Legacy. You know, we apply today for funds that we will get in 2 years, and then we have 2 years to spend it. And so, of course, the market changes a lot. Heck, landowners, you know, a lot can happen in the life of a landowner. So we do have agreements up front, but then you still have to deal with the reality of circumstances that change, including price. So that's, there has to be some flexibility, but also some standards to try to streamline. Streamlining is extremely important. I can't remember the rest of the questions.
Great. That's a good answer. Let me give Bob one from Eric Held, who asks, Bob, how do you see the United States Fish and Wildlife Service landscape, the LCC groups, working to help with forming meaningful mitigation plans at the landscape level?
I think the LCCs are an excellent tool if they can achieve their goals in creating the context for making these decisions. They will identify over very large regions what the most critical habitat to protect or restore should be, and using that as a reference, then mitigation decisions could be made over that large, a large region to really focus money on the best places for the protection of a variety of species. So excellent tool, long way to go, very much in the right direction.
Okay. One from Stephen Johnson for Leigh, and Bob, you may want to comment on this as well. He asks, cooperative fundraising from public agencies and foundations for landscape scale initiatives has met with some success, as your projects indicate. What are the prospects for major donor fundraising for such projects? Do you have examples where individual cash donors have been helpful?
Oh, yes. This Wildlands and Woodlands Conservation Project is designed around reaching private funders. And this is an experiment that's still in process, but we have some experience. A lot of donors, or many donors, respond very positively to the idea of collaboration, to the idea of achieving landscape scale results. And those two things really ring true with donors. At the same time, they want to know about the site-specific, resource values, habitat values, and we can present that as well. So it is the area that we know the least about and have the least experience with, and there's actually a polling question because we're very interested in the experience of others, and invite your ideas, suggestions, and names.
All right. Actually, Jim will pull another polling question up, which is, what is your primary funding source for aggregation projects? That's relevant to the question just asked, and people are beginning to answer that. In the meantime, I have a question from Pat Cody, who is a regular listener to this series. And Pat, I will paraphrase your question to say that I understand that in lieu mitigation projects have a mixed track record, sometimes not very good. The TNC program in Virginia, Pat says, has been criticized for not completely getting to the finish line with some of their projects. And Pat asks, what will be the difference between projects like that and projects such as the one being done in Massachusetts? And I will add to that, to the future of mitigation projects across the United States. And Bob, I suggest you might be the best to answer that question.
Well, I think by and large the in lieu fee program in Virginia has been quite successful. It has accumulated, and again, in lieu fee programs are those that take money for smaller individual impacts on wetlands or other resources, accumulate that money and spend it in larger sites. They've bought a whole bunch of large sites with the money so accumulated. Like any land acquisition, closing a deal is not always within the power of whoever's negotiating. I think in lieu fee programs have their place, and they can be very much improved by having a regional plan or a comprehensive plan and spending in accordance with that plan, rather than going out and seeking whatever property may be available. But the next generation of mitigation would combine in lieu fee programs with large project-related programs like the Disney Wilderness Preserve in the Northern Everglades that I think can be quite effective. What's not necessarily effective is little bits and pieces of mitigation on sites which together don't amount to very much.
Thank you, Bob. The next polling question is been answered. That most, in response to the question, what is your primary funding source for aggregation projects, we have 16 people reporting that multi-source public funding, including local funding, is the predominant source. There's a little bit of private financing. And I can add to that I know that private and nonprofit philanthropies are now just beginning to learn about mitigation anyway in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and that interest in the technique is growing. There may be a meeting of some of those funders in the next couple of months, and it's an exciting prospect to think of fine-tuning this strategy and helping to have it be effective in wider and wider geographies. Okay, I have another question here. It's from Daniel Patrick O'Connell, also a frequent listener to this series, and I want to invite other people to add questions that they may have for our guests today. Dan asks, or Pat asks, excuse me, isn't the mitigation done by NPDES and other permit holders with funding under Section 319 of the Clean Water Act a large potential source of funding for watershed-wide conservation projects? Bob and Leigh, you may have a thought on that as well.
We've not actually looked at that kind of mitigation in our paper or in our study. It's an interesting idea, but I think that's worth pursuing. It's not a big money thing right now. ELI has looked at all the sources, but it potentially could be.
All right, Leigh, do you have anything to add to that particular question?
No experience with that program, but we're certainly, very interested in all sources of mitigation funding, because I do believe that it will be an increasing source of funding for conservation, but we have very little, if any, experience with it now.
All right. I have a question from Suzanne Klimek. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, in North Carolina. She says, I represent an ILF program in North Carolina that is both criticized and recognized. Despite our critics, we have met our requirements and put our projects in areas where they will generate the best environmental outcomes. We have over 500 projects totaling over 3 million linear feet of stream and thousands of acres of wetlands that have been restored, enhanced, and preserved. My bad for not reading to the end. This is not a question, but a statement. Bob, are you familiar with ILF programs?
Well, ILF is in lieu fee programs. I'm not sure what she's discussing, but for some years the North Carolina Department of Transportation had a very innovative program where instead of just building things in median strips, they pooled their money from the impacts of highways on wetlands and did some really big, charismatic, great large projects that had long-term value. And so they've been doing some good work there. There's a bit of a history to that program, but on balance, a good thing.
Well, I now, thank you for that context. I now understand that that may have been in response to Pat Cody's pointed question about in lieu fee projects. And let me suggest that there's probably more work to be done in the field and in the research sector on how to best roll out these programs, and that's something that we will be interested in watching for and perhaps participating in as time goes on.
If I could just add to that, Jim, I mean, I said earlier on in the presentation that maybe 40% of the mitigation money being spent nationally was not spent well. So it is not done poorly. It's not a good remedy. The point of our paper is to do it better, and there are plenty of programs and projects out there that can be roundly criticized over the last 10 or 15 years.
I just want to reemphasize two of the points that your paper make eloquently is that we have an opportunity to do these projects at least in sync with state wildlife action plans, and that might accelerate or amplify their impact. And also we have an opportunity to do them so that they're contiguous to other sites and begin to form landscape scale conservation corridors and collections of protected lands that are particularly relevant in the age of climate change. So I think we have a lot to learn in this area, and I think we will very probably return to this subject on future sessions of this internet broadcast. Let me ask one final question, and it's for Leigh, but let me extend it to Bob as well. It's from Julie Stoneman, and she asks, how can we get more detailed information about the structures and agreements in place for cooperative fundraising and fund distribution among partners? And let me extend that to how can we get more information on aggregation and mitigation as we go forward from each of you and the sources that you're familiar with? Leigh?
Well, I know that the current MOU that we have for the Wildlands and Woodlands project, which is the one project that I now have an MOU for, is, if not already, will be on the website of Wildlands and Woodlands. And so that is available, and I also would recommend Jim Levitt's report on on mitigation and aggregation, because there are some very useful details. As far as the agreements for cooperatively distributing money, really small grants programs are the ones that I'm experienced with. You could just contact me, and we can, to the extent that there are formal procedures, we'll be happy to share them.
And Leigh, do you have a email address that people can contact you at?
Yes, it's youngblood@mountgrace.org, MOUNTGRACE.org, so youngblood@mountgrace.org. Jim, if I could ask you to ask the last two questions, that the polling questions about funding aggregation, I'd appreciate that.
All right. Let's see. All right. So, in what ways have family and other foundations collaborated to support your aggregation projects? I'll ask, as I call on Bob, I'll ask the audience to respond to that. And Bob, more information on the techniques that you're promoting in the field of mitigation. How can people learn more? How should they pursue this opportunity?
Well, you could find our paper, I believe it's still up on the Environmental Law Institute website. It was published in several versions, but there's something on the National Wetlands newsletter for March, April 2010. I think you can still find it there. And happy to contact me at rbendick, B-E-N-D-I-C-K, @tnc.org. I can refer you to some more places. The other thing on this general topic of cooperative large-scale projects, I'd recommend you to the Nature Conservancy's comments to the America's Great Outdoors outreach process. They are on nature.org, our website, quite extensive, but we believe that this kind of aggregation, flexibility in federal funding, and the ability to partner between public and private funding around larger landscapes is a key strategy for the future of conservation in the U.S., and we discussed that in some detail in our comments.
Excellent. Okay, Leigh, I'm going to report out that other is the leading response to that. I think it's lunchtime on the East Coast, and people are beginning to turn to their next tasks. So I'm going to wrap up at this point, but simply to say that there is indeed more information available at wildlands and woodlands.org on the techniques of aggregation and mitigation, at least as they are practiced in Massachusetts. You can also contact me. I have been recently contacted by several officials in other states to learn more about how they might use these techniques to advance land conservation in their geographies. And I look forward to talking to all of you again later this fall as we have another session of this Internet broadcast series. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Leigh, for excellent explanations of emerging techniques in conservation finance. Good afternoon.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Jim.